I think that Texas has the opportunity to lead the nation in how we steward our natural resources, and also in innovation. That's been a tradition of ours for the last 150 years, going all the way back to the cattle drives. Yeah, I grew up on the ranch, and my father was running the agribusiness side of things. So at that time, about 13 million acres, not just in Texas, in the United States, but all over the globe. And so was very well aware of um, the reach of the ranch, and certainly of the research and the science behind not just the cattle side of things and the quarter horse program, but the wildlife piece, that we really put some effort into that. One of the things that I was well aware of as a kid was the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute, which my father was involved with as a trustee, and the founders, Dwayne Leach, and my grandfather, and Leroy Denman, and then going back to Cesar Kleberg, my great 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 uncle, who'd started the institute with the $10,000 investment from his trust. That not only was the ranch involved from a private standpoint in the stewardship of our natural resources and wildlife conservation work, but that the institute was doing real practical work on the land, water, and wildlife resources in South Texas. And so, as a child, I was interacting with biologists and geneticists and uh, cowboys, and went to school with their children. And so it was just a way of life growing up in the outdoors, but also within a culture that not only uh, valued the outdoors and our natural resources, but was actively working in it day to day. Caesar Kleberg is my great 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 uncle, and he's born in 1873 in Cuero. He, after attempting about a semester of school at St. Edward's, ends up being a clerk for his father, Rudolph, up in D.C. He was a representative in Congress. And comes back from that. He moves to the ranch and does some work for his uncle, Bob Kleberg, and ends up at Norius, where he basically spends the next 4 decades being ranch manager down at the Norris Division, which is one of 4 divisions of the King Ranch, and really being the father of some of the first wildlife regulations on private lands about 20 years before Aldo Leopold, and doing a lot of wildlife conservation related work before its time. In fact, in 2009, the Texas legislature designated Cesar Kleberg as the father of wildlife conservation in Texas. And my family, going back obviously to Cesar, but over the generations, has really taken that legacy to heart. And we continue that not just through Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute and its practical research work that's going beyond just South Texas now. It's doing work on a global scale, that each of us in now what is the 6th and 7th generations try and express and honor that wildlife legacy, not just here in Texas, but in the work that we've done all over the world. One of the things that I think Caesar saw when he was there at Norius, in part because he was involved in the railroad being established from the Corpus area down to Brownsville, was you had an influx of men and really civilization that was coming south through the Wild Horse Desert. And with that came increased pressure on game, deer and turkey. And so one of the things that he decided to do, really 2 things: institute game regulations, really 4 rules. One was we didn't hunt deer during the rut. You didn't hunt wildlife around water. You shot turkey not with a shotgun but with a rifle, and didn't shoot quail on the Cubby Rise. So that was some of the first regulations on private lands, which ultimately, when he became a member of the Oyster Fish and Game Commission, which then became Parks and Wildlife Department, that some of those rules and regulations carried themselves through into really what we saw then and see today in wildlife and hunting regulations. The other thing was he saw the role that man was playing in really the commercialization, the market hunting, the real pressure on wildlife populations. They weren't really viewed as a resource to be conserved, if you will, but a resource to be utilized and used up, and couldn't. I think Caesar saw that man played a role in making sure that we managed that resource just like we do water and other things that are vital to our health as a species. And so I think that kind of view of the world and view of man as the true steward of our environment and those resources is something that I've carried on, and I think that's part of his legacy. And the way that we really see, if you think about the North American model for wildlife conservation and the kinds of things that Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute and even my own family investment in useful wild plants and those kinds of projects, that they see that we're responsible for the future health of not just our environment, but how that ties to the future health of our economy and our growing population. And so we've got a real responsibility to play. So I view my early years at the ranch as being one in which I was learning about my and our role in not just in an environment, but how do you take advantage of and harness natural resources to the benefit of not just a family, but really a whole community. And ended up, after I graduated from college, I went down to the southeastern Amazon basin, which is essentially the size of the western United States. And where I was on the front lines of where a lot of the deforestation was occurring. So an area the size of Maryland was being deforested every year. And in many instances, there were market forces that were driving that. It was timber. It was, in some cases, ranching. The ability to invest in land at, let's say, $100 an acre, fell the forest, utilize that land. One of the things I saw in Brazil was the market forces really were driving a lot of that deforestation, and that there was a real lack of regulation. There were rules on the books, but there was no enforcement. So what you had was a tremendous felling of trees and an entire ecosystem at a very rapid rate. I saw what I thought the western United States and Texas almost felt and looked like in terms of the settling of a new frontier. Some of the places where I lived for about 3 years were becoming new towns while I was there. They were just getting electricity. They were just having access to some of the things that we take for granted here, and realized that if in Texas, the United States, we're not careful and we don't pass down that real conservation ethic, that belief that a healthy soil, healthy plants lead to healthy water and a healthy environment, all that is tied to our economy and to the health of us as a species, then I don't think we have a very bright future. So in some ways I was seeing the past, and I was seeing an acceleration of what could potentially happen in the future, and decided to dedicate my time to enhancing our natural resources and finding a balance between the economy and the environment here in Texas. And so I started work along the U.S.-Mexico border in land management, and then got into work at Parks and Wildlife Foundation, where there was a real balance between public access, because I believe that in a state that's 95% privately owned, private lands are the key to land, water, and wildlife and plant conservation in the future. I believe that just because at scale, that's really who you're dealing with are private landowners. But you also have about 5% of that land that is accessible to the public. And in order for those that live in cities, 83% of our population lives in cities, to understand the value of all that open space, they've got to have some kind of a connection to the natural world. And if you can get them access to it, that's the best, in my estimation. That's the best thing you can do, is create that connection, because then that creates love, and then there's a real caring for the outdoors. The next best thing, in my opinion, is to show them something that maybe they wouldn't otherwise see. And that's in part why I got involved in creating films about the natural history of Texas, because there are a lot of us that, or a lot of people in Texas that cannot afford either the time or the money to go see some of these far-flung places, see things like bears or mountain lion or mountains. And if we can create that connection, even if it's for a few hours in a movie theater, between the natural world and what the reality that they're living, and make them understand that there is a connection between the plants and that open space, and that a drop of water that lands 800 miles from here actually could end up in your faucet. That what happens out there actually does impact the health of the environment here, to our air quality, and to our quality of life. So for me, I sort of have seen, I think, the outer edges of taking advantage of our natural resources in a negative way. And I think Caesar saw that in the early 1900s, and he could see what would happen if we, as humans, decided not to take a stand. And he was able, with several 100,000 acres, to really prove that you could take a stand and really have an impact at scale. Because when he established a private reserve at Norris, at that time, there was serious pressure on wild turkey and white-tailed deer populations. Today, there are 5 million white-tailed deer in the state of Texas. At that time, I think they were down into the low 100,000s. And so he had a vision, but he also could do something about it. And so that's kind of what's led me, and I think others, my father, to do the kind of work that we're doing. Because if you see that there's some challenges that we face, and you know that you can do something about it, and then you don't, then it's hard to live out that legacy if you don't actually follow through with it. I think one of the unique things about Caesar was that not only did he see that he could have an impact there locally on 800,000 acres, but that what happened in South Texas actually had an impact broadly, not just in Texas, but nationally, because you had people coming from, frankly, all over the world to see this wildlife haven, to see how you ranched at that scale. We had developed a new cattle breed, and we're getting into the quarter horse business. There are a lot of things that were going on there that were at the epicenter of the agricultural and the ranching business at the time. And I think that if he were alive today, he would see that Texas has that same opportunity to be the model for how we manage our natural resources, how we deal with a changing climate, how we deal with a growing population, and how do you feed what may be 50 million people by 2050 in the state of Texas? How do you provide power? How do you provide water to that many people? And I think there's a way to do it. I think Caesar proved in the early 1900s that you could ranch and you could also care for wildlife, and that he foresaw a day where wildlife would actually be more valuable than beef cattle, which has happened in the last 20 years. And that I think we're going to see a time where I think we're near this time where how we deal with an abundance of water whether that's a hurricane or a flood, how we deal with times of severe drought, uh, how we manage our soil, uh, how do we become more independent? And by that, I mean food and fiber and energy. And in Texas, if you look at all the other states in the union, we've got 174 million or so acres, and so we've got that land resource. We've got the water resources, and we have the energy resources. Depending on how you qualify energy, it's a lot of different things. It's the sun, it's the wind, it's our fossil fuels, and I think that Texas has the opportunity to lead the nation in how we steward our natural resources, and also in innovation. That's been a tradition of ours for the last 150 years, going all the way back to the cattle drives, and how Texas was leading the way in many ways in innovation, and we continue that today. So I think that same spirit, that Caesar spirit, and what drove him in the early 1900s, I think is still in us as a people. We've just got to, in my opinion, have more people that are standing up and being those models of how we actually can coexist, and frankly are talking about the opportunities that we have to harness those natural resources to lead in the coming decades. The way that I grew up, and my parents, I would argue, grew up is a lot different than the way my children are. And my father actually grew up in Kingsville, but obviously, working with cowboys at the ranch. My mother grew up in the Fort Worth area, but spent a lot of time in Gulfway. It's a small town, Texas, a lot of time outdoors. And with my daughters living here in Austin, we just have to be really intentional about not only how we get them outdoors and how often we get them outdoors, but also taking them down to the ranch. And I think the work that I have chosen to do is also something that's very intentional on my part, because I want them to see that what I value is what I do on a daily basis, and that and I think, frankly, my parents did the same thing. I mean, they were my mom was in part a photographer, my dad was working at the ranch, and so we saw that those values were present every day, and they didn't have to say anything. And to a large degree, what I value in life, my kids can see, not because I tell them necessarily, but because that's what I do, and then that's how we, in most part, how we choose to spend our time is outdoors. I even did a film a couple of years ago with my oldest daughter, and we went on a canoe trip to the Devil's River for the first time, and got to film that whole experience. And so doing that kind of stuff, because certainly at that age, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, those experiences will stay with you forever.